Before we get today's show on the road, I just want to take a moment and put out any fires before they have a chance to start. Today, we are reviewing a system that is a bit out of the norm for my channel. As you folks already know, I am always enthusiastic for tackling affordable high-end gear, and that is not going to change. However, I'm also not the kind of guy who is afraid to review the equipment that sits in the luxury seats of HiFi as well. So, reviewing this system today doesn't mean we are headed in a new direction, nor does it mean that I'll be changing the review format just because this system is indeed expensive. One thing I will say, this review is very long. I wanted to turn over every single stone for you guys because that's exactly what you deserve. For those of you who can't stand my rambling for more than 10 minutes at a time, I cannot blame you, and neither can my wife. So I have chaptered out the entire video so you can watch it at your pace. Anyway, the Maria 800 and M4s as a package comes in at 133,000 euros. At the time of this video, that's 142,000 US dollars. Putting that into perspective, that would be that would be 3 complete sound sheds with everything included. But hey, no matter how pricey a speaker or system is, I still have a job to do. And with a warm welcome back to New Record Day, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Alright folks, this video is being sponsored by Lone Crow Audio. A while back, Lone Crow reached out and asked if I wanted to take a crack at the Daniel Hertz Maria and M4 system, which of course was an easy yes. But here is the deal. These guys also offer a ton of great brands that you might dig as well. Borenson, Axis, Cardus Audio, Van Dan Huel, Solid Steel, VPI, MoFi, Furman, Sonos, Origin Acoustics, Velodyne, Yamaha, Rel, HiFi Man, Audio Research, Inuos, PBN Audio, Rose, AccuPhase, and Tannoy. Yeah, you know, I mean the good stuff. The real good stuff. And if that's not enough, Lone Crow also offers design and installation services as well. They also invite anyone to hear the sound of Sonoma County in California, where they have 40 years of experience and are ready to help you gear up with whatever your audiophile heart desires. Even more, Lone Crow ships all over the United States and are constantly making new incentive deals and giveaways. With Borenson, Axis, and Daniel Hertz, they'll be holding a special deal to grab a Forte amp or Maria at half price when bundled with speakers. They also have speaker cable and wire incentives with speaker orders and are eager to drive a new wave of audio enthusiasts with honest information and great prices. Last, with every sponsor that I work with, there's always a tipping point when I know that I'm working with the right crew. That tipping point came quickly during a phone call with Lone Crow when they said, "Ron, just tell it like it is and be honest. That's all that we want out of this review." So, without wasting another second, let's do exactly that. Tell it like it is and tell the truth. Before we chat about the M4 loudspeakers, we need to get to know who Maria is. While on the surface, this amplifier might look like any other integrated amplifier, it's important to note that there is a little more under the hood than meets the eye. Maria is offered in 2 configurations, the 350 or the 800 as we have today. The key difference between the amps is that Maria 800 is configured for any of the Daniel Hertz bi-amp speakers and offers more outputs to accommodate these speakers like the M4. Taking a look at Maria from the front panel, you are greeted with a power button to the left followed by an input selector. Maria has 3 analog inputs with 1 meg-ohm input impedance, allowing connections to any device with analog outputs. This 1 meg-ohm input impedance is a feature pioneered by Mark Levinson's company, Cello Limited, in the 80s, which according to Daniel Hertz virtually eliminates loading of the input signals, ensuring the cleanest possible sound. The other inputs labeled coax, USB, and W has you covered for digital coax, USB, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth connections. Now, with all the inputs of Maria, including the analog inputs, everything is being handed over to Mighty Cat and being processed by C-Wave. And do not worry for a second, we will chat about what the heck that actually means in just a moment. Smack dab in the middle of Maria, we have our branding and logo, and to the right, a volume knob. And yes, of course, headphone listeners can rejoice as well. They haven't been left behind. I didn't spend a ton of time with the headphone section, but I can say I had no issue driving any headphone that I have on hand, and it all sounded very good. I also took note that last, it is worth mentioning, all the knobs that we are looking at are stainless steel, feel well made, and are quite tactile in the hands. Taking a look at the back of Maria 800, to the left you will find the bank of digital inputs that cover USB and digital coax. There is also an additional USB input labeled DSP, which is used for accessing the Mighty Cat software and making changes to the amplifier. To the right of this bank, there are 4 pairs of binding posts, which are all designed in-house. To the right of these posts, there is an IEC inlet for power, and last, a handy tool for tightening down the posts with the included speaker wire that comes with the amplifier. And that reminds me, these are the cables that come with the system. You have a power cord, USB cable, and what looks to be PVC jacketed speaker wire. Anyway, the binding posts are cool. I dig the design, and I would imagine for those who think that cables matter, you could do what you want with the included wire and use something more to your liking, but keep in mind, it would either need to be bare wire or spades from what I can tell to work with the custom binding posts. One last thing that I should mention for folks who want to ditch the included power cords that come with this amp for something a little more exotic, that might be a challenge with Maria. Sitting right next to the IEC inlet for power is the holder for the tool to tighten down the binding posts. There is not a ton of room here, and I noticed that larger aftermarket power cords don't fit really all that well without pushing up against that tool holder, and I would hate for you to break something, so just a heads up about that. As far as Maria's body is concerned, when I lifted the amp out of the box, I thought to myself, either these Wheaties are finally paying off, or Daniel Hertz forgot to send the rest of this amplifier. The amp is light as a feather, and it surprised me. It also surprised me as I got a closer look. This enclosure is not made out of metal. Now, Daniel Hertz has this trademarked material as wave glass, which I will give it to them. That sounds cool, but wave glass, which is mentioned on Daniel Hertz' website, is also known as Perspex. A quick Google search of Perspex, which ends up being a brand name of acrylic, gives us our answer that unfortunately, my yearly trips to the gym haven't been paying off after all, and this amplifier simply doesn't weigh that much. Included with the amp is what appears to be a canvas bag, so you can, I don't know, pack it up and take it with you to your buddy's house, but one thing that should be mentioned so you aren't digging around and scratching your head like I was, Maria does not include a remote control. That's right, every time you want to crank the volume on Maria or every time that you want to change the inputs, you get the pleasure of standing up, walking over, and doing it yourself. Why is this? Well, I would imagine that we can all stand to lose a couple of pounds, but jokes aside, according to Lone Crow, when I asked them, where the heck did they hide this remote control? They said, number 1, Mark says this is for performance reasons, and 2, most streamers have volume control, and the Maria knob functions as a max volume limiter. So folks, there we have it. We got all of the nuts and bolts of Maria covered, but what about Maria's voice? And for that, my friends, let's have a chat about Mighty Cat and C-Wave. All right, if Maria has a brain, that brain would be the Mighty Cat chipset, an amplifier integrated circuit that features a digital input and analog output in a single block, complete with an internal architecture and embedded software to operate C-Wave, which again, we will cover in just a second. The Mighty Cat software provides tools for active crossovers, time alignment, EQ, and more. The entire setup is configurable and programmable using the Canvas 3 Master software, a Windows-based application. The DSP port on the rear panel of Maria allows connection to a Windows PC for installing any of these modifications. I did reach out and ask if this particular software is accessible by the end user, and the short answer is no. However, Daniel Hertz would be able to help you with this over the phone and help guide you in making changes if needed. Now, for those who are paying close attention, you already picked up on something that's important to highlight. With the Mighty Cat chipset featuring a digital input and analog output, the reality is there is only one way to skin this cat, mighty or not. All the inputs, whether it's digital or analog, are going through this chipset, which means the analog inputs are going to be converted to digital and back to analog. So this got me thinking, it might be interesting to pop the hood of this thing and see what's what, but since Daniel Hertz already offers high resolution images on their website, it made it easy to get some visuals on Maria's guts, so let's dive in and take a peek. Taking a look at this image, the main board, which is blue and to the left, looks pretty foreign to me. I did notice some branding on the main board itself, which is labeled Elegant Audio Solutions 2016. Doing a quick Google search turned out a company located in Austin, Texas, and with a few more searches, I did notice this company has supplied boards to other audio brands as well. Either way, I'd imagine this blue main board is what houses the chipsets and goodies that covers all the Mighty Cat and C-Wave processing. How all of this stuff works and what's what, well, your guess is certainly going to be better than mine. Now, as for the amplifier section to the right, I do see some things that I have seen before and that I am more familiar with. These two switching power supplies right here appear to be Hypex SMPS 600 and 400s, and with a close zoom in, sure enough, we can see the Hypex branding. The four mono modules below are a little more difficult to identify, but my spidey senses tell me they appear to be OEM Hypex UCD 400s. Granted, I have no idea if any of this stuff has been modified, upgraded, or added to, but at least we have a better idea of the power section of Maria. And speaking of power sections, and before I forget, Maria kicks out 200 watts per channel at 8 ohms and 400 watts per channel at 4 ohms. Anyway, I like and have always liked the Hypex stuff, and I've always felt like their amps, especially the Encore designs, do tend to get out of the way of the music and also respond to whatever the front end is doing. So, if I was placing my bet here, the voicing of Maria, whether it's the 350 or 800, really is certainly being influenced by that blue board to the left. Mark Levinson believes that analog, or the sound of analog, not only sounds better than digital, but also believes people can feel better when listening to analog. Now, to this, I can agree. It has also been my experience that the analog experience is indeed something that does, for lack of a better term, it feels good. Cutting my teeth on this channel, listening to a lot of vinyl, and in most cases seeking out records that were 100% analog, there is little doubt in my mind that Mark and I would quickly crack a beer and agree that the smooth, continuous waves from all analog recordings making their way to our eardrums are indeed the peak of high fidelity, and in my humble opinion, the end of the line when it comes to the best of the best. Fast forward to 2024, building an all-analog system does come with more complexities than you can shake a stick at, and while it certainly can be done, what about 90% of the recordings that are completely digital? As I'm sure you have guessed already, because you guys are the smartest viewers on YouTube, C-Wave is a technology that Mark believes is the answer to that particular problem. In other words, C-Wave, at least according to Daniel Hertz, can take anything digital, even a performance on YouTube, and make it sound like a reel-to-reel recording. I know, this is a lofty claim, and you know what? If I wasn't skeptical, I would be a liar, and a liar is something that I am not. Either way, taking a blurb directly from Daniel Hertz's website, here is what they have to say about this technology. C-Wave, or continuous wave technology, is a result of 30 years of research and development by Mark Levinson and a team of experts in audio and health fields. C-Wave is the first upgrade to digital audio since it was introduced in the 1970s. C-Wave is the highly innovative, disruptive, and proprietary technology that the world has been waiting for. A way to get the emotion of pure analog audio from all digital sources, including streaming, movies, and internet audio. Imagine YouTube music sounding like the best pure analog, high-speed open reel tape recordings. C-Wave is a finely tuned reverb algorithm that fills in the spaces with original musical information, making the brain respond similar to pure analog. And folks, there we have it. It sounds to me like C-Wave isn't really trusting just the DAC to put the pieces back together again and hoping that it does a good enough of a job. No, it is indeed adding something else through a reverb algorithm to complete the puzzle of putting the digital music back together again. So, in the most distilled and simple way that I can say it, C-Wave is DSP, also known as digital sound processing. 264 pounds, folks. And let me tell you, having unpacked these things all by myself, I can confirm every single pound is legit. I will start by saying, and I wish I would have filmed this, unpacking these from the wooden crates really wasn't all that difficult. The speakers are shipped shrink-wrapped and covered in a soft cloth that is actually sitting on a foam-covered wooden dolly that honestly made it manageable to solo this entire install. Granted, these noodle arms can barely bench press a small child, so your results might vary and having a friend help out might be a great idea. The M4s are also massive, and the first speaker that I've had in the sound shed that made me think maybe I need a bigger listening room, but kidding aside, these things are freaking monsters, so be ready for that. Starting from the top, we find ourselves a compression driver tweeter, just below it a 12-inch paper cone woofer which tackles mid-range, and for those about to rock, at the bottom you will find a massive 15-inch paper cone subwoofer. With a rated sensitivity of 95 decibels, this is the kind of speaker that can easily knock down a few walls, shake the clothes off your significant other, and peel the paint off the walls if you want. Just turn up the volume, and there you go. And last, just below the subs, you will find two front-facing ports, and when the M4s get going, you can excite a room or a sound shed in a quick hurry, and the dynamics heard in these speakers is quite the ride, but more on that in a minute. The cabinet work, including the veneer and finish, is as perfect as I can imagine a speaker finish ever being. Every single seam that meets is precise. Every single piece of the veneer is even, and if I was judging the M4 on craftsmanship alone, well, it's beautiful. Now, with a fair amount of hyperbole out of the way, I did also notice something that is questionable. The drivers, and that includes all of them, might be flush mounted. It's sort of hard to tell, to be honest with you, but at the same time, there are these plastic beauty rings that are installed, and all of them are sticking out from the drivers. While I do understand the aesthetics of this approach, and they do look nice, I will also be fair enough to call a flag on the play and make it clear that these kinds of aesthetic decisions almost always come with consequences. Especially with the tweeter and mid-range, those higher frequencies are going to smack up against those sharp edges and without a doubt will have an impact on the speaker's response. Just how much of an impact is hard to say, and I am not about to take a screwdriver to these speakers and go cowboy on this review, but I will just say, in my humble opinion, Daniel Hertz would have been better off flush mounting everything, including the beauty rings, keeping everything as close to the cabinet as humanly possible. And last, on the back of the M4s, you will find a cutout with the house-made binding post, clearly labeled subwoofer and mid-high, so connecting Maria is pretty straightforward. I tried a number of locations with the M4, starting a few feet away from the wall, which loaded the entire front of the shed and gave me a massive wall of sound. And I gotta be honest, I am not a fan of that. So, pulling the speakers out 4 feet into the room, I could tell that the stage started to open up. But it wasn't until I pulled them out 6 feet into the sound shed that I was happy with what I was hearing. While I tried placing them even deeper into the room, I found that the localization of information from the drivers themselves became a little bit too distracting, and I felt like I was sitting too close to these massive speakers. Anyway, at 6 feet into the room, things sounded nice and measured pretty well. Here is my in-room measurement from this location, and it's also worth mentioning that I experimented with toe-in quite a bit. Starting with the M4s pointing directly into the room with no toe-in, I found the upper mid-range to be too soft and too relaxed. Later in the measurements, I'll be able to quantify this and help visualize why pointing the speakers almost directly at me worked out best for my listening preferences. The first time I fired up the Daniel Hertz System, I must admit that something happened that I didn't really expect. Looking at these massive speakers and knowing they use a compression driver for the tweeter, I was a little worried the presentation might be too forward and bright. However, within 4 to 5 minutes of my reference playlist, I was at ease, and with a sigh of relief, I knew the voicing of these speakers would actually be easy to get along with. While I did notice there isn't as much air, extension, or decay at the very top end as some of the best examples that I've heard, I do think all the fundamentals of the treble territory is accounted for. That is to say, while the sound of decay, top-end details, and yes, as crazy as it sounds, the sound of air, and no, not hot air, wasn't quite as clear or defined as some of the best stuff that I have spent time with. Now, when we get to the measurements, some folks might think based on the frequency response, we should have enough air and extension to satisfy, meaning there is indeed a rise in the response right in the area where we would be hearing these attributes. But it's important to understand the amplitude or volume of that bandwidth doesn't always lead or guarantee to greater details throughout that spectrum. Either way, if we're talking about the fundamental hit of a crash, splash, or a ride, and not focusing so much on the decay, this was easy to appreciate with the M4s. Cymbal hits sound vibrant and lively while never sounding forward or pokey, which is always a plus. At the same time, the M4s often offer satisfying presence that horns and well-done compression drivers are known for. Also, brass instruments and horns sound lively, ballsy, and for lack of a better term, they sound realistic. With that being said, there were times, however, that some pitches of upper mid-range and top-end information of higher frequency instruments sound a little bit incomplete to my ears. That is to say, it felt like some frequencies of the top end were perfectly balanced, but others were softer. Later in the sound clips, I'll have an example that perfectly illustrates what I'm talking about, and you will be able to hear it for yourself. As I've already mentioned, only extreme elements like air and ambient seemed a little shy during my hours of listening, but I did notice how quickly everything that I was hearing would resolve in the top-end fundamentals, which I really appreciated about this tweeter. For folks who might be worried about snakes hissing or cymbals crashing and overshadowing the rest of the performance, that's not what I heard at all. At no point did I hear anything ring out or sound pokey in the top end, and again, the system offered a stop-and-go action in the fundamentals. This quick-to-respond performance is what I kept hearing in the top end of the M4s, which again ended up being one of my favorite aspects of this speaker. Later, when we get to the measurements, take notice of the spectral decay, as indeed it will help paint a picture as to why this system sounded exactly as I'm describing right now. Dividing the mid-range in two categories. First, the heart of midband certainly sounds dynamic, lively, and to my ears, more robust than what I would call completely neutral. With the M4, we hear a paper cone driver delivering the performance, and that's something worth celebrating. The texture and tone of the mid-range offers a natural and lifelike presentation that paper cone drivers seem to do better than any other material that I have spent time with. With that being said, as I mentioned, I noticed more body in the lower mid-range than what I would call perfectly neutral. To my ears, vocals sound a little larger or bigger than what I would call balanced or as clean as a whistle. While this observation lessens as frequencies go up, I continue to latch on to lower female vocals and most male vocals sounding more robust than some of the more linear speakers that we have spent time with. The more I listened to this speaker and observed this robust or bigger sound in the vocal region, it occurred to me that, subjectively speaking, this is the kind of thing that is hard to either celebrate or complain about. Again, it could come down to priorities and what you are searching for in your next hi-fi system. Even more, it seemed to me that there was something here that felt and sounded, for lack of a better term, maybe intentional. Now, I am not the kind of guy or reviewer that goes back and forth with manufacturers as I experience their products. And to be honest, I have learned the hard way that discovering and articulating these things on my own is by far the best path forward for me. So, I don't know for a fact if what I'm hearing is indeed intentional, and by all means, I would encourage Daniel Hertz to join the comments section to share their thoughts, but I will say this, I am certain what I'm hearing is there. Later in the measurements, I'll be able to point to where I believe this area lives, and like always, I encourage you to listen to the sound clips for yourself. In any event, the lower part of the mid-range sounds bold. It sounds alive. It sounds bigger than neutral, and for me, while tastefully done and certainly not a massive distraction, I just can't bring myself to call it true to the recording. But hey, that's my ears, and only you can decide where you land on it for yourself. Now, as we travel north from the heart of mid-range and we move into the upper mid-range, this to me, besides the dynamic capabilities of the M4s, really is the sonic fingerprint of what these speakers are all about. Holding it up to the light, what we have here is a very easy to listen to speaker for anything that you throw at it. If you want to crank Metallica full tilt, go for it. You won't need earplugs, I promise you. AC/DC loud enough to knock down a wall? Yes, absolutely. Step right up. Daniel Hertz can do that all day long. So, let me guess. You guys are waiting. You guys know me and you're waiting for the but. I know you are, so here's the but. But there are folks out there, and I'd say including myself, who might feel this area of the speaker is a little too relaxed or soft and might feel that while pleasant and easy to listen to, it comes with a little more hit in the resolution department than what they are willing to part with. I, for one, noticed this softness over and over and couldn't wait to get these things on the bench to verify if what I was hearing was something that I might be able to quantify. Spoiler alert, I can and I will when we get to the measurements, and you can easily hear this for yourself in the sound clips. 20 hertz, folks. We're talking about teeth rattling, bone crushing, 20 flipping hertz. And yes, as loud as you want. I stopped turning it up as I cranked triple digits because at 45, I like to keep my ears working for at least another decade or two. Putting my money where my rambling mouth is, here again is the in-room response after I massaged these speakers into their final resting place, which ended up being just about 6 feet into the sound shed. So yeah, I've mentioned high bandwidth like 20 times in this review, and here is the proof. No need for subwoofers with the M4s, and I'd imagine regardless of where you live or how big your castle is, you're going to have all of the deep bass that you could ever want. Setting that aside, the bass is also very dynamic and powerful sounding. While my cup of tea is open baffle bass and I'm addicted to the speed of that sound, the M4s aren't the slowest horse in the race by any stretch of the imagination, but these speakers do energize the room like you might expect from cinema, and the room does come to life with the bass. The M4's bass sounds explosive and it moves air, and this is something that a lot of folks will certainly appreciate. As for texture and tone, once again, Paper Cone delivers the goods, and I found it pretty easy to latch on to all of the timbres of upright basses or track the nuances heard from a cello. Electric bass sounds punchy, dynamic, and lifelike. Kick drums will shatter your rib cage, and every audiophile on the planet will probably find the M4's bass satisfying in one way or another. Again, while not the quickest sounding bass that I have heard, and more of a cinematic or heavy-handed bass experience, I still enjoyed it, and I think that a lot of audiophiles will appreciate it just as well. Now, because the system is being powered by Maria, and we already know that C-Wave is handling the processing, I had to know just how much this was having an impact on what I've heard. Granted, I knew by pulling Maria out and trying some well-known gear that I would lose the biamp capabilities and in turn lose the subwoofers on the M4s. But for me, and more importantly, for you guys, the sacrifice was worth it, as the audio geek in me wasn't going to get an ounce of sleep until I knew how much Maria was contributing to the sound of the M4s. Switching out Maria for my Holo Audio Serene Maydac and the rig into a few different amplifiers, this is what I discovered. First, I felt there was almost always a trade-off of a thicker, richer, and perhaps warmer body heard in Maria for a cleaner and precise presentation when I swapped out for different amplifiers. Now, I want to be careful with my words here, so please give me a minute as I unpack the details. See what I did there? When I talk about the stuff like decay structure or time domain information, I'm not talking about tone differences. Often these subtle differences are easy to hear in the room as the system breathes, but even still, these subtleties can be easy to miss. So yes, things like air, decay, and the micro details that I happen to love, they do exist. And when changing out Maria for more familiar amps, I felt these rigs with the different amps shined a brighter light in those areas of the performance. With some amps, it was less noticeable, and with others, it was more. But one thing is for certain, Maria definitely has a voice of her own. I suppose this could be a good or a bad thing depending on how you spin it, and it really comes down to priorities and what you want. If you are willing to let go of some decay structure, top-end details, and analytical information in favor for something a little more bold, well, there you go. But if you demand to hear everything, and I mean everything packed into the recording, now you know this system might not give you every single detail that you are listening for. I should also mention, and I have a feeling it's coming the second I press the publish button, it's entirely possible that this Mighty Cat software might be able to change some of this, whether it's EQ or whatever, and if so, I'd encourage Daniel Hertz to leave a comment and shine a light on whether or not this level of customization is indeed possible. First, the imaging of this system is quite good, and I found the core performance to be believable and satisfying. Vocals are easy to track, and while it's not the most holographic experience that I have ever heard, I do think the Daniel Hertz system has a capability of sounding three-dimensional and creating a phantom image close enough to the real thing that most people would be impressed and satisfied. Regarding the rest of the soundstage, how high, deep, and wide the system is able to play, I would say the vast majority of information that I hear is concentrated as a mid-row or a back row experience. So, for folks who are used to horns and compression drivers sounding very forward and in your face, that's not what I'm hearing with this rig at all. Later in the measurements, I walked through both the vertical and horizontal response of the M4s, and when it comes to their width or the ability to throw hard-panned information to the extreme far right or left, this is not the speaker's ace in the hole. The massive 12-inch woofer has many advantages, and sure, the tweeter is crossed pretty low around 1500 Hertz, but being honest, I wasn't blown away by information scattered all around them. With other speakers we have reviewed that provide tighter curves and wider dispersion on the horizontal plane, I've noticed time and time again that they seem to excel at giving that spooky, where the heck is that coming from like experience. Now look, the M4s aren't necessarily bad in this category, but just being honest, I don't think it's their strong suit. But that reminds me, before we move on to the sound clips, there is at least one last thing we must chat about that is definitely one of the strong suits of the M4s. All right, folks, I'm not creating a new category for every review moving forward, but it would be foolish of me not to spend a few minutes discussing one of, if not, my favorite things about this system. The dynamics of Maria and the M4s are off the charts. The way quiet and loud passages interact and play against each other really needs to be heard to be appreciated. Every single time I sat down and critically listened, I found myself creeping up on the volume knob, and before I knew it, the entire sound shed was lit up with what I could describe as a legit and believable live performance. Bass guitars lay down a foundation that keeps you glued to your seat. Drums, especially kick drums, rattle the heck out of your ribcage. Electric guitars explode on the scene with energy and impact. With the M4s, the more you turn things up, the more dynamic the performance sounds. I loved this about the system, and I can count on one hand how many speakers I've reviewed that can rival this level of dynamic power. No BS. It's really fun to crank this system, and it will absolutely be one of the things I really miss as this system heads back home. All right, folks, time to bust out the headphones and see how the Daniel Hertz System sounds compared to the reference clips. All of the recordings are done using my trusty Earthworks QTC40s and the Zoom F8N field recorder. And with that, let's run through the samples and compare notes at the end. Here we go.
Engineer, where are you headed? Engineer, where are you headed?
No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar, jamás no quería saber nada más, nunca más. No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar, jamás no quería saber nada más, nunca más.
So for me, the Daniel Hertz System sounded quite nice in all of the clips, but there were some deviations that I noticed when we compare it to the original reference tracks. Because I've been doing these same tracks for a while now, and I haven't changed my recording process, I'm starting to collect a lot of data points that really help us hear some key differences from speaker to speaker that we have been reviewing. Either way, I'd love to hear your feedback. Overall, I thought the Daniel Hertz System sounded smoother than the reference recordings, but also sounds heavier or thicker in the lower mid-range on every song. There are a couple of reasons that could be causing this, and I'll be discussing that when we get to the measurements, but after going back and forth several times, I also felt like the upper mid-range is softer than the reference tracks as well. One standout track for me that I kept coming back to is the second track with the strings. Playing those back to back, it's pretty clear just how much resolution is packed into those strings, which really pops in the reference track. When the recording is compared, it's definitely darker on the recorded system. Just as a refresh, let's play a part of that side by side so you can hear what I'm talking about. So, some might like just how smooth the sound is on the Daniel Hertz System, but to me, it sounds like it is lacking some of the details heard in that reference track. As for the third track, which features a ukulele and female vocal, this clearly shows some of the heaviness that I mentioned in my listening impressions. When I play these tracks back to back, you can hear significantly more body under her voice, almost giving a heavy or breathing or chestiness to her voice that isn't present in the reference track. Let's check that out again.
No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar jamás. No hubiera pensado que yo me iba a enamorar jamás.
So I can't quite verbalize exactly what this is or what's going on, whether it's bloom or a resonance, but it just sounds heavier to me on the Daniel Hertz System. Regarding the last track, this again demonstrates another observation, a softness in the upper mid-range. If you play back the last 5 or 10 seconds of this clip, you can hear a difference in tone in the top end of whatever instrument this is that's being played. To help you guys hear this back to back, let me play this one more time. Can you hear that? It's almost as if there is a pitch difference in that instrument. And for me, it's not so subtle. Again, later in the measurements, I'll talk about what might be going on with this, but there is certainly enough deviation here to indicate that the voicing of these speakers isn't a straight line or linear enough to play back the music exactly as it was recorded. Earlier in the review, I mentioned that I compared the sound of Maria to my own reference rig, and I tried a number of different amplifiers. These sound clips cover those same comparisons, but it's important to note, the subwoofers are not engaged in these clips, as using my reference rig would mean that I lose the biamp capabilities of Maria. So, making this as fair as possible, the subs are just simply disconnected. And with that, let's have a listen and chat about what we hear.
starlit sky, our love's secret line, like leaves we soar so high. Beneath the starlit sky, our love's secret line, like leaves we soar so high.
All right, folks, again, we are talking subtle differences here. And keep in mind, the speakers are not only the exact same, but the microphone wasn't moved at all as I changed out the gear. Playing this back to back and listening a number of different times, it wasn't as obvious as hearing the differences in the room, but I do indeed hear some of the things that I've talked about throughout this review. While the speaker is going to have the largest impact of what we are hearing, I am quite confident that Maria does indeed have her own voice, and I can hear it in these comparisons. To me, Maria sounds a little thicker or meatier sounding in the lower part of the body. Without repeating what I've already said before, I also hear a little more clarity and detail in the second clips of these songs, which trades that bigger or bolder sound for something a little more detailed and analytical. So, I am curious, folks, what did you hear? I'd love to get your feedback, so don't forget to leave your impressions in the comments section down below. Well, folks, the larger a speaker gets, the harder it is to measure. The M4s weigh a whopping 260 pounds and are massive. So, hoisting these up on my hydraulic lift was a bit of a challenge, but with a little bit of help, we made it happen. Now, walking you through these measurements will take some time, and I would ask for a little bit of grace and patience as we make our way through them. Either way, the first measurement that I took on access to the tweeter at 1 meter was a complete mess, and I quickly realized getting something a little closer to the truth would require pulling the mic back further than I typically do. So, at 50 inches on access to the tweeter, this is what we ended up with. In this example, we are looking at a gated response from 200 Hertz up to 20K, and as you can see, the response isn't quite as linear as some might have hoped for. However, and this is where I need some patience, the chances are, unless you're sitting on a very high chair and your ears are 46 inches off the ground, this really isn't a reason to be concerned. So, lowering the mic's location down and shooting in a few different spots, I landed on the best location, which happened to be about halfway in between the mid-range driver and the tweeter, which was 41 inches off of the ground. Ironically, in my Eames chair, I'm sitting even a bit lower than this location, but I would imagine most folks are going to be closer to where the speaker ended up measuring the best, so let's consider this our reference location and move forward from here. Shooting from this location, this is the response that we got, and again, comparing the on-axis response from the tweeter we were just looking at, we are now looking at a reasonable response, but also helps tell the story of what I heard in the M4s and what I would imagine what you would end up hearing as well. A couple of things stand out here first. Take notice in the rise in the response in the heart of midband that spans from 250 Hertz up to approximately 1200 Hertz. In my listening impressions, when I mentioned that vocals do sound a little bit more bold or offer a little bit more body, it's entirely possible that those observations do line up with this area of the response. At the same time, when I mentioned how easy the speaker is to listen to and also mentioned a softness in the upper harmonics, it's interesting to note that from 1500 out to 7K is soft in this response. That is to say, aside from a lift at 2500 Hertz, the vast majority of this speaker's upper mid-range bandwidth does show a relaxed fishbowl or broadband dip that indeed could explain why the speaker is rarely, if ever, offensive or fatiguing to listen to. It also explains why cranking these guys with AC/DC is nothing to be afraid of doing. So, is there a trade-off? Absolutely. While some folks will love being able to play just about anything with the M4s, even cruddy or less than stellar recordings, some folks might find them to be lacking in precise and honest details that are in this particular area of the bandwidth. And you know what? That's also fair and wouldn't necessarily be wrong. Now, after this softer voicing of the upper mid-range, we do see a rise in the response that starts around 7K and falls around 15K. The peak of this rise is around 10K, and for those who might be panicking or thinking this part of the response points to a bright speaker, the truth is, I don't think that it does. First, you must understand that a perception of brightness is almost always much lower in the response than most audiophiles would actually assume. It's been my experience, it typically sits anywhere between 1 to 3K, like much lower than what you might be thinking. Second, something up that high, like what we're looking at, 10K and above, will always lay down in the room. How do I know this? Well, I can show you. Again, taking a look at the in-room response of the M4s from the listening location, this response is pretty dang linear, and sure enough, while there is a slight rise at 10K, it's actually a straight line for the rest of the response. And I will tell you right now, never ever do the M4s sound forward or shouty to me. Taking a look at the horizontal response from the same reference location, and again using a gated response, there is something here that is also worth chatting about, and I believe might help illustrate other observations that I heard in my time with the M4s. First, the overall response on the horizontal plane is uniform, which is a good thing, meaning we do see an even fall away from red, which is our reference location, all the way out to 40 degrees, which is in blue. But what's interesting is if you take notice from 1K to about 3K, where we see the softness in the response, that each distance from each measured location is greater than the rest of the measured response. Knowing the crossover frequency is probably sitting right around 1500, this can help us understand what could be going on here. You see, a 12-inch mid-range woofer is great at a lot of things, but its ability to spread its wings at higher frequencies is unfortunately not one of them. As the driver is playing up that high, it's beaming those frequencies, which is why we aren't seeing as tight of a pattern on the horizontal plane. Now, in the event where this tweeter was crossed over even lower, let's say 1000 Hertz or even lower than that, I would expect the response we are looking at in this area would actually tighten up. Why does this matter? Well, the room response, also known as the power response of a speaker, is the sum of the on-axis response combined with the vertical and horizontal response. All this to say, when I mention the speaker doesn't sound quite as wide or far-reaching with extreme panned information, could be the result of what we are seeing in this very measurement. Taking a look at the vertical response, and again, I'll need your patience on this one, I decided to shoot from the reference location up and also down. Starting with the mic at the reference location and moving up, we can see there is a dip or hole in the response that's going to point a finger at the crossover point of the speaker. Now what's interesting, going from red, our reference location, to orange, 4 inches up, and yellow 8 inches up, the hole in the response gets deeper. But when we look at green 12 inches up and blue 16 inches up, the hole in the response decreases. Why is that, you ask? I know, it's tricky, but it makes perfect sense once it's explained. What's most likely happening from the red to yellow, the drivers become 180 degrees out of phase. As we move higher from that location in green and blue, they come back in phase, which is why we see the dip in the response start to tighten up again. Now, moving down from the reference location, the response doesn't change as much as moving up. The orange line is 5 inches down, yellow is 10 inches down, and green is 15 inches down. I was planning on moving down even more and taking one more shot in blue, but ran into some technical issues, but the trend we are already seeing is good enough to understand what's going on here. While we don't see the exact same location of the dip in the response as moving up, we can see a similar trend starting to form around 2K, and I would imagine this is all phase related and based on the time arrival of the drivers having a hard time summing together. Pulling up the spectral decay, the speaker shows a clean and quick response from 1500 Hertz and up. This indicates that the tweeter being used is quick to respond and, from what I can see, doesn't display a large amount of stored energy that we should be concerned about. It's actually quite clean. This evidence all points as to why I liked how quick to resolve the tweeter is. However, from 1500 Hertz and down, there is a fair amount of stored energy, which is easier to see in this bird's eye view of the spectral decay. What's interesting to me, combined with my commentary about the frequency response and the rise in the response in the heart of midrange, is that we also see another piece of the puzzle right here. This might help us understand why lower vocals sounded as if they offered more energy or led the charge and sounded so robust. Now I'll say this, just in case you feel like all of this commentary is negative, it's not that easy. It's just helping you folks understand the why behind what I heard and what I believe you should expect when listening to this speaker. I'd also say this, and I mean it, 10 out of 10 times, if I had to pick whether I wanted stored energy down lower where we see it in the M4 or up higher, let's say in the upper mid-range, well, that's easy. I'd pick this every single time, but hey, that's just me. Well, folks, there you have it. Another review complete, and my goodness, this one was a lot. For the folks who took the time to soak it all in, thank you. I know my reviews can be a little bit much, but it's always been my goal to give you guys the entire pie, not just a small slice of buy this, buy this, buy this, buy this. It's all great. Everything's wonderful. Everything's wonderful. Everything's great. Everything's wonderful. Everything's great. Everything's wonderful. It gets boring after a while. As for the Daniel Hertz System, I am glad that I had the opportunity to check it out and see what happens when we explore systems that literally cost as much as a lot of homes here in Texas. While this system did a lot of incredible things and was a blast to listen to, it's difficult to say how it all adds up. As you know, I rarely talk about value when it comes to my reviews, and that's because I have no idea what you are willing to spend on a system. For those who are truly interested in this package, it would be foolish and irresponsible for me to recommend that you should just smash the checkout button and blindly buy this rig. I would imagine those who are going to drop that kind of money would want to hear what this sounds like for themselves, and that's exactly what I would encourage you to do. I will leave Lone Crow's information down below, and I would imagine that would be a great place to start. As for me, I definitely appreciated the dynamics and scale of this system. It does indeed sound alive, energetic, and incredibly powerful. I also appreciated the overall tone of the speakers, but I do wish I had a little more resolution in the upper mid-range for me to call it perfectly balanced. I also felt like the lower mid-range was a little bolder and more robust than what I would call perfectly neutral, but again, I'd imagine this particular attribute might sound nice to a lot of folks who enjoy that larger-than-life vocal presentation. As for Maria and all its technology behind it, I'm not completely convinced it's the answer that I'm looking for in a modern audiophile system. While the amp does indeed sound smooth and refined, it also sounded like it might be sacrificing some details, especially at the very top of the audio spectrum. In any event, I want to thank Daniel Hertz and Lone Crow for giving me this opportunity and invite them to join in on the conversation down below if they want to add anything or provide their feedback. In the meantime, I have 260-pound speakers to pack up and other goodies to review. To be honest with you, I have been very sick the last month and a half, and I need to catch up on reviews as quickly as possible. I appreciate all of the support, and with that, I will see you Daniel Hertz loving audiophiles in the next video. Yeah. That is exactly how I feel about this rig, and I feel good about it. I can sleep tonight. Take care.